first presenter this evening is Noah Brasgalla. In 2023, Noah advanced to the final round of the Sarasota Regional STEM Fair with his research project. Outside of the classroom, he was voted by his teammates and coaches to the Senior Leadership Council of Sarasota High's football team in spring of 2022. In fall, he will attend University of Florida to study finance. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Noah Brasgalla and his project, Where's the Beef? On the effects of preservation methods on the oxidation rate.
Alright guys, so I'm Noah, and this is my project on a growing problem in the food service industry, and it's affectionately titled, Where's the Beef? So if you're like me, you've probably left the steak out to thaw too long, or the chicken. So the premise of my research was to evaluate the short window between the conventional time that you leave your steak or chicken out to thaw, 25 minutes, to reach room temperature, and the time it takes to oxidize, which is only shortly after that window. So they can oxidize a very short time after they reach room temperature, which is what you've been doing, and for this reason, in the food service industry, every year expensive beef samples go to waste against their interests. So the purpose of my experiment was to find a way to prolong this reaction of oxidation, which is where the meat turns brown and it goes bad. So a common theme in this experiment was my attempts to find a correlation between the levels of moisture in the beef samples and the time it takes to oxidize. So I theorized that the oxidation rate was directly correlated with the moisture level, and a lower moisture level would ultimately lead to a slower rate of oxidation because of a liquid protein called myoglobin. And so multiple methods of eliminating surface moisture were used. I used 3 methods that are conventional, and you can use them in your household. So a little background on this research. Prior studies have experimented on the factors that affect oxidation and how it affects consumption problems, but it's lacking in specific experimentation in the field of moisture elimination and how that correlates to oxidation. So a 2019 study by the Department of Health Sciences in Malaysia showed that oxidation is affected by both intrinsic and extrinsic factors, like storage conditions, like the temperature that it's frozen in, and the fat composition of the samples, so whether you're buying, some 80-20 ground beef or really lean. But however, no specific experimentation was conducted in the field of moisture elimination to isolate that variable. And then other case studies by the CDC have found links between oxidation and inflammatory damage, and also involuntary weight reduction. And further studies also found a correlation to contracting foodborne and bloodborne pathogens from eating oxidated beef samples. So the oxidation reaction, it's very basic. So in metals, it will rust. That is one example of oxidation. That's why you wouldn't, like me, leave a cast iron out with water in it. And another example that I saw that's a little funny was in guacamole. You make guacamole, and you're supposed to eat it within a day or it grows brown. And some scientists, they put it in a vacuum sealed bag, and so no oxygen could cycle through, and it didn't go brown within a day. It was 2 days old, and they were still able to eat it. So the protein myoglobin in its oxidized form is called metmyoglobin, and prior literature shows that beef can oxidize from both deoxymyoglobin and oxymyoglobin, which are kind of reverse ends of the spectrum of having a lot of moisture and a really low amount of moisture. And a 2019 study by scientists from China, Ireland, and France found that even the most advanced packaging technology is negated by the effects of lipid oxidation. And this oxidation can occur within 3 minutes of the conventional time to reach room temperature. So if you left your steak out to reach room temperature for 25 minutes, it might oxidize 3 minutes after that, and you might forget. So, and obviously the obscure fields that I found, the correlation between external moisture and oxidation in rust and guacamole, a weird combo. So this is a visual representation of all these reactions. So it can go from purple red to oxygenated, a bright red, but the main reaction that I was exploring here was the transformation from bright red to brown with the metamyoglobin with the oxidized protein. So my ultimate research question was, how do varying moisture levels with preservation methods affect oxidation rates in beef? And the goals that I experimented with, I hypothesized that one of the 3 preservation methods would effectively slow the oxidation reaction through elimination of moisture based on the principles of oxidation, and a new understanding of a correlation between moisture levels and oxidation would be discovered. And I also wanted to find a viable method, which would hopefully be one of the 3 methods I tested. So some of the experimental risks, obviously when working with beef samples, there's always the risk of cross-contamination of samples with utensils. This is why we always rinse and wash in between every cut, and because this could lead to the potential contraction of bloodborne pathogens if a beef sample wasn't bled properly, or if there was any contact with an open wound. And then slicing the meat samples and the pellicles. I'll get to what a pellicle is in a second, but obviously slicing is a risk with sharp knives. And there's also the solid fat conversion to the liquid state, which I just cut fat off the samples and blended it, so obviously the blender blades were a risk. And the aseptic technique I used during this experimentation, cleansing all surfaces with chemicals to prevent cross-contamination, and dish soap used on all surfaces, and prevention of any contact of the samples with uncovered skin. So some of the preparation I did, so the 3 methods that I chose in addition to the control steak were, so the first one was a base dry age. And if you don't know what dry aging is where you take a special type of bag that acts as a breathable membrane, so oxygen can cycle out, and it forms a hard exterior, and it's used mainly in restaurants to complexify the flavor profile of the beef. And so you have to vacuum seal the bag, and I left it for 28 days to age before slicing it off and testing it. And I did this with 2 other samples, except I also added in for one a dry brine, and a dry brine is where you leave salt on the sample for 24 hours prior, and the salt will absorb any moisture that's close to the surface, and it's very effective in eliminating moisture. And another one was kind of a reverse effect, which was adding a fat injection, which obviously increased moisture, and that actually had reverse effects on the oxidation reaction, making it even faster. And there was what was needed was also a consistency in all the samples, so an equal thickness of 2 to 5 centimeters in all the samples, and also a consistent storage temperature during the aging process and during any other times where you would need to store it, which I did 36 Fahrenheit. It's a very common refrigerator temperature. So the way I tested the oxidation, so with the control sample, I sliced it into three separate samples for variation and for consistency of the results. And I tested that, and I just waited until there was a slight discoloration in each sample, and I recorded that time. And then after each of the other 3 samples dry aged, I sliced off the hard exteriors, which is the pellicle. The pellicle is the hard exterior that forms while you're dry aging. So I sliced that off and repeated the same process of slicing each of them into 3 different samples and testing for oxidation by looking for slight discolorations. And I recorded the average time. And here's an example of the control test oxidation. So it's kind of tough to see, but there are slight discolorations in each of these 3 sliced up samples. The most notable one is right up here in the top left corner. It went from white to slightly brown. And here are the results with the oxidation time. The control oxidized in a very normal time after reaching room temperature. It was about 12 minutes. The base dry age went about 55 minutes without oxidizing, and the dry brine and its compounded effects with the dry age took over an hour. While here's the supplemental fat method, which negated the effects of the dry age a little bit and took about 45. So the way I interpreted this data, the sample data favors the alternative hypothesis, and my p-value was lower than the significance level, so I can reject the null hypothesis. So I did reach a new understanding that there is a correlation.
Sorry, give a minute, go ahead.
Okay, so I did reach a new understanding that there is a correlation between moisture and oxidation, and the elimination of moisture with the dry age and salt absorption drastically decreased the rate, and the compounding effects of the salt and dry age decreased the oxidation even more, with almost 5 times as long as a regular beef sample. So in conclusion, I did reach an understanding that there is a correlation, and because added moisture through the supplemental fat injection negated some of the effects, I was able to establish a sort of spectrum of moisture and oxidation. Future research has tremendous upside in this field, but any more advanced research would require regulated research institutions using electron microscopes and need quantitative oxidation results. These are my references. And I'd like to thank my mentors, Ms. Harshman and Mr. Stevenson. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Harshman and my good friend Nicholas Cox for helping me get this project approved. It was a long process. Thank you.